The rain pounded heavily on the asphalt, turning New York streets into muddy rivers. Cars passed by indifferently, neon lights reflecting in the puddles as the city continued its relentless march. 6, a street dog with a dirty coat and tired eyes, dragged his paws along the drenched concrete. His ribs showed beneath his thin, worn-out skin, a result of years of hunger and neglect. 6 was used to the indifference the world offered. Among alleys and backstreets, he moved, searching for shelter or a scrap of food. It was a night like so many others until something unexpected interrupted his usual path. Under a makeshift awning, almost hidden by the shadows of the storm, a small figure was huddled. 6 sniffed the air cautiously. His instincts warned him of something unusual. He approached slowly, with hesitant steps, maintaining the caution that life on the streets had taught him. As he got closer, he realized it was a child, a girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, so small and fragile that she was almost lost in the midst of the torrential rain. The child was shivering from the cold. Her eyes, fixed on some distant point, seemed empty, as if she had already given up fighting against the night. 6 stopped, uncertain. The girl's dark eyes captured him in a way he hadn't expected. There was something in her he recognized, a deep, ancient loneliness, the same one that consumed him. He took a few steps forward until the girl moved slightly, her thin shoulders shaking in the icy wind. She finally saw him. Their eyes met, and there was no fear, no screams, only a shared silence between them. With a timid gesture, the girl pulled something from the pocket of her worn-out coat, a piece of dry bread. She held it out to the dog with trembling hands. 6 hesitated, sniffed the air again, still wary, but hunger won out. He approached slowly and took the bread carefully, chewing it slowly, as if understanding that this was all she had to offer. The rain continued to fall, relentless, but in that moment, for both of them, it felt irrelevant. The alley, the night, the cold, none of it mattered anymore. There was only that silent presence and the shared weight of their weary souls. Time seemed to freeze in the alley. 6, after devouring the piece of bread, stayed close to the girl. He felt the faint warmth emanating from her body, as fragile as his own. An instinct, something deeper than simple survival, kept him from leaving. The girl, huddled against the wall, could barely keep her eyes open. Exhaustion, hunger, and fear had drained her strength, but the dog's presence, with his watchful gaze, offered a small spark of safety. Hesitantly, she stretched out her trembling hand and touched 6's wet fur. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his head and looked at her. For the first time in days, Emily felt something that wasn't complete despair. She didn't know how many days she'd wandered New York streets. She had run away from home recently, long enough to lose track of time. Her stepfather, a man she barely knew, carried the strong smell of alcohol, a deep voice, and heavy hands. Emily had learned early that, at home, it was better to be invisible. When the shouting started that last night, she hid, as she usually did. But this time, something inside her snapped. She couldn't bear it any longer. The fear of staying outweighed the fear of leaving. She ran as fast as she could, fleeing without looking back, running into the unknown. Now, sitting beside 6, Emily wondered what her life would become. The city seemed enormous, indifferent, as if she was destined to disappear into the shadows. Her stomach growled with hunger, but the food she had given to the dog was all she had left. 6, as if sensing the girl's inner turmoil, suddenly stood up. His ears perked at the sound of voices in the distance. A group of men approached, dragging garbage bags, laughing loudly. They didn't notice Emily and 6, but danger lingered in the air. Emily's heart raced. She closed her eyes, wishing to be invisible. 6 growled softly, moving to place himself between her and the men. The tension rose, but luckily, the group passed by without noticing them. Even so, 6's growling didn't cease right away. He didn't relax until the voices faded into the distance. Emily slowly opened her eyes, looking at the dog by her side. She had never had a friend, human or animal, but in that moment, something changed. She stretched her thin arms around 6's neck, burying her face in his wet fur. The tears came silently without sobs, just a release of the pain she had kept locked inside. 6, without fully understanding what was happening, remained still. But he felt it. He felt what Emily felt. The fear, the loneliness. And somehow, he knew that she needed him just as much as he needed her. When Emily finally released the hug, something inside her seemed to have calmed. She looked around, trying to find somewhere they could take shelter from the night and the cold. She couldn't spend another night out in the open. Her eyes settled in one direction, as if an idea was beginning to form in her mind. Six, as if he understood, sniffed the air and started walking. Emily stood up, her legs shaky, but she followed the dog through the deserted, puddle-filled streets. They walked together, two lost souls in a city that never stopped. They were searching for something, a shelter, a bit of hope, anything that could pull them away from that suffocating darkness. The city lights reflected on the wet sidewalks as Emily and Six's footsteps echoed through the silent streets. A store clock read 3 a.m. Time continued its relentless march, but for them, the only concern was surviving another night. Further ahead, a small, empty park appeared amidst the concrete. There was a single large tree, and a rusty sign marked an abandoned playground. Six stopped, as if waiting for Emily to make a decision. She looked at the space in front of her, realizing there weren't many options. The exhaustion was too heavy to keep going. With a sigh, Emily walked over to the tree and sat on the wet grass, hugging her knees. Six settled beside her, keeping watch. The cold wind blew through the trees, bringing a sharp chill, but somehow Six's presence made the cold feel a little more bearable. The night dragged on, but the feeling of despair began to give way to something Emily could barely understand. Something new, something she couldn't name, but that was there, right beside her, in the form of a dog who, for some reason, had chosen not to leave her alone. The hours crawled by, and the wind showed no mercy. Emily huddled beneath the tree, trying to hold on to the little warmth left in her body. Sleep threatened to overtake her, but the fear of drifting off in the open kept her awake. Six, loyal by her side, remained vigilant, his eyes alert to the slightest movement. Finally, the sky began to lighten, and the first rays of morning illuminated the park. The sound of the first cars and buses breaking the silence signaled that the city was waking up again. Emily knew she had to move, but her legs felt too heavy. Suddenly, a familiar scent reached her. Fresh bread. Her stomach growled loudly. Struggling to her feet, she followed the aroma to a small bakery across the street. Her hunger was intense, but shame and fear kept her standing outside. Six sensed her hesitation and looked at her, as if encouraging her to give it a try. With hesitant steps, Emily entered the bakery. The place was empty, except for a middle-aged woman arranging fresh bread on the counter. The woman looked at Emily and her dog with an expression of surprise and compassion. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice gentle. "Are you hungry?" Emily, embarrassed, could barely respond. She just nodded, clutching her hoodie tightly as if she could hide behind it. Six stayed by her side, watching every move. The woman smiled kindly and picked up a fresh loaf of bread. "Here, take this. You don't need to pay. I can see you're in need." Emily looked at the woman, wide-eyed and incredulous. She wasn't used to kindness. She took the bread with trembling hands and whispered a barely audible, "Thank you." The woman observed her for a moment before asking, "Do you have anywhere to go?" Emily froze. She didn't know what to say. The thought of trusting someone terrified her. Noticing the girl's hesitation, the woman sighed and said, "I know of an orphanage nearby. They could help you. There'll be food, a warm place to sleep. If you'd like, I can take you there." Panic surged within Emily. The word orphanage echoed in her mind like a danger signal. She had never been to one, but the idea of being left in a strange place away from Six made her want to run. She shook her head, her eyes filled with fear. "Hey, it's okay," the woman said, noticing her reaction. "No one's gonna force you into anything. But think about it, all right?" Emily clutched the bread to her chest and bolted out of the bakery with Six right behind her. Fear still held more power than any promise of safety. Emily and Six ran through the streets of New York, distancing themselves from the bakery. Her hunger was partially eased, but the fear lingered. She knew she couldn't go on like this forever. The streets were unforgiving, and she felt increasingly vulnerable. The woman at the bakery had been kind, but the thought of an orphanage made her uneasy. What if they tried to separate her from Six? What if the orphanage was just another place where she would be invisible, just another child among so many? The terror of losing the only friend she had was stronger than the cold, the hunger, or the exhaustion. They walked for hours, passing through alleys, parks, and empty streets, until exhaustion finally took over. Emily spotted a small, abandoned shed, its doors slightly ajar. The girl and the dog slipped inside quietly, curling up in a corner, away from anyone who might pass by. It was an improvised shelter, but the most important thing was that they were together. Sitting on the cold ground, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the words of the bakery woman. The suggestion of the orphanage echoed in her mind, along with the fear of being found. "I know of an orphanage nearby." The phrase seemed to offer a promise of safety, yet it reminded her that trusting adults had never brought her anything good. Her heavy eyes slowly closed, her exhausted body finally giving in to sleep. Beside her, Six stayed vigilant, his ears alert for any sound that might signal danger. Emily woke to the sound of distant sirens. The sky was beginning to lighten, painted with shades of pink and orange. She felt the warmth of Six beside her, and for a brief moment she wished she could stay there forever. But her stomach growled again, pulling her back to the harsh, inescapable reality. "Six, what are we going to do?" she murmured, gently stroking the dog's fur. He lifted his head and licked her hand, as if trying to offer her some comfort. Emily knew that continuing to run wasn't an option. She was weak, and Six was too. They needed food, a safer shelter than that cold shed. Maybe the orphanage was the only solution. But what if it was like all the other people who promised help and then forgot about her? What if they separated her from Six? The thought alone made her shrink in fear, but a part of her knew she had no choice. With one last gentle pat on the dog, she stood up, determined to find the orphanage. They walked through the now busier city streets. The sound of people coming and going, indifferent to the girl and her dog, brought an even stronger feeling of isolation. After timidly asking a few hurried strangers, Emily finally found the building described by the bakery woman. The rusty iron gate and the old facade of the building indicated that St. Christopher's Orphanage was a modest place. There was a small garden at the entrance, and a few children played in the distance, their laughter muffled by the noise of the city. Emily approached the gate with hesitation, her steps slow and uncertain. She held tightly to the makeshift leash she used for Six. As she watched the children playing, a tall woman with kind eyes and a tired appearance stepped out of the main door. She looked directly at Emily, and her face softened into a gentle smile. It was Anna, the orphanage director. "Hi, sweetheart," Anna said in a welcoming voice. "Are you okay? You look like you could use a place to rest." Emily didn't respond right away. Her body was tense with anxiety. The urge to run was strong, but she knew she couldn't keep running. There was nowhere left to go. Her eyes filled with silent tears, and she simply nodded. "Come on in," Anna said, opening the gate. "You and your dog can stay here. He can sleep with you if you'd like. We'll take care of both of you." Anna's words were unexpected. Emily hadn't thought anyone would allow Six to stay with her, but those words sparked a small glimmer of hope in her heart. With cautious steps, she entered. The weight of the decision felt overwhelming, but the idea of finally stopping, even for a moment, was too tempting to resist. The air inside the orphanage was warm and inviting, a welcome change after so many nights in the cold. Anna guided Emily to the dining hall, where a few children were still having breakfast. The smell of food filled the room, and Emily's stomach rumbled loudly. She shrank back in embarrassment, but Anna just smiled kindly. "I'll get you something to eat," said the director, while Six settled beside Emily. She returned with a bowl of hot soup and a piece of fresh bread. Emily ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, while glancing at the other children around her. None of them seemed to pay her much attention, which made her feel a little more at ease. Meanwhile, Six was given a bowl with food scraps, and he devoured it quickly. "What's your name?" Anna asked, sitting down beside Emily. "Emily," the girl replied, almost in a whisper. Anna smiled. "You can stay here as long as you need, Emily. We'll take care of you, and of Six too." Emily nodded, but inside, she was still conflicted. It was hard to believe this place would be different from all the other places she'd been. Her heart bore deep scars, and trusting someone was the biggest challenge she faced. After breakfast, Anna led Emily to a small room. "This is where you'll stay. There's a bed for you, and Six can sleep on the floor right beside you." Emily looked around. The room was simple, but it had clean sheets, a soft blanket, and a window overlooking the garden. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she could sleep without fear. She lay down on the bed, and Six immediately curled up beside her, as he always did. The days at the orphanage passed slowly, but with a certain peace. Emily still avoided interactions with the other children, preferring to stay close to Six, who had become a beloved presence at the orphanage. Anna was kind, always asking how Emily was, but never pushing for conversation. She seemed to understand that the girl needed time to build trust. Then, one morning, something changed. Emily was in the garden with Six when the director appeared, visibly tense. Beside her was a man Emily had never seen before. Tall, serious-looking, but with tired eyes, he watched the girl from a distance. "Emily," said Anna, her voice gentle but filled with concern. "This is your uncle." Emily felt the world around her stop. Her body went rigid, her heart racing. Uncle? She hadn't known she had one. No one had ever mentioned him. Fear rose like a wave, and she instinctively took a step back, holding tightly to Six's leash. The man, noticing Emily's reaction, took a step forward, but kept a respectful distance. "Emily," he began, his voice filled with quiet regret. "I'm your mother's brother. I didn't know what had happened to you, but when I found out, I came as quickly as I could." Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Why didn't you come before? Why did you leave me with him?" Her voice trembled with anger and pain. The man lowered his head, the weight of guilt evident in every gesture. "I didn't know," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I didn't know what was happening to you and your mother. When I found out, it was too late. Your stepfather, he kept me away from you, and I failed. I know I failed, and I'm so sorry for that." Emily didn't know what to think. His words made sense, but her heart was guarded, protected by layers of distrust and fear. She looked to Anna as if searching for some kind of guidance. Anna, sensing the turmoil within the girl, stepped closer to her. "Emily, I know you've been through a lot, and trusting isn't easy, but maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe he really does want to help you." Emily looked at Six, as she always did when she didn't know what to do. The dog was there, calm but alert, ready to protect her from anything. But this time, there was no visible danger. It was a struggle within herself. She took a deep breath and looked at the man who said he was her uncle. "Will you let Six stay with me?" The man smiled, a small but sincere smile. "Of course. He's a part of you, isn't he? I'd never separate you two." Those words eased something inside Emily. The thought of not being separated from Six, of maybe having a place to stay, seemed possible. For the first time, she felt that maybe she could try. "I'll try," she said, her voice soft but steady. Anna smiled, and the man nodded, visibly moved. "Thank you, Emily. I promise I'll take care of you." As the sun rose over the horizon, casting a gentle light over the garden, Emily took her first step toward what could be a new life. With Six by her side and a glimmer of hope in her heart, she knew that, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running away. She was walking toward something. Epilogue. Months had passed since that day at the orphanage. For Emily, the changes had been profound, but not without challenges. Starting her new life with her uncle felt strange and unsettling at first. She didn't know how to act in a home where she didn't need to hide or protect herself from constant threats. But gradually, the routine of living in a safe place began to settle in. Her uncle's apartment, though simple, was comfortable. He enrolled her in a new school, where Emily struggled at first, not only with the subjects, but also with trusting new people. The classroom felt like a silent battleground, where her classmates' curious glances kept her on edge. But her determination to adapt grew each day. Her biggest support, as always, was Six. Every day when Emily returned from school, Six was there, waiting for her. The dog had become a constant and comforting presence in her new life. He now had his own bed near the living room window, but often at night, he would still climb onto Emily's bed, as if he knew she needed him close. One day, as Emily made her way home from school, leaves drifted slowly from the trees, marking the arrival of fall. She felt the cool air on her skin, a reminder of how much time had passed. Now, the life that once seemed only made of fleeing and fear had taken on new colors. There were challenges, of course, but there was also hope. As Emily opened the apartment door, she heard the comforting sound of Six's paws running toward her. He greeted her with his usual joy, wagging his tail and jumping around her. Emily laughed and knelt down to hug him, feeling the familiar warmth of her dog. "Hey, buddy, I missed you," she whispered, stroking Six's fur. Her uncle was in the kitchen, preparing something simple for dinner. When he heard Emily's laughter, a smile formed on his face. That sound had been rare in the early months, but lately he was hearing it more often. He knew Emily's adjustment would take time, that the scars of her past wouldn't fade overnight, but seeing small signs that she was beginning to trust him was more than he could have hoped for. "How was school today, Emily?" he asked without taking his eyes off the pan. "It was good," she replied, surprising herself with her answer. In the early days, she hadn't been able to say much about school. Now the word good felt like something important, something that showed things were slowly getting better. After dinner, Emily sat on the couch with Six by her side, while her uncle watched the news from the other side of the room. It was a simple routine, but that simplicity brought a peace Emily had never known before. She allowed herself to relax, something she had forgotten how to do. Holding the remote, Emily hesitated to change the channel. She looked at her uncle, who noticed her uncertainty. "You can pick whatever you'd like to watch," he said with a gentle smile. This kind of freedom was still new to her. A small gesture, like controlling the TV, was a choice that had once seemed distant, out of reach. But now, in this new life, these little freedoms held immense meaning. Emily chose a nature documentary. She had always liked seeing images of animals running free through forests and fields, perhaps because, in her own way, she had also felt the need to run and escape. Now, however, there was no reason to run anymore. As the program started, Emily pulled a blanket over herself and Six, who nestled beside her, his breathing calm and steady. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could imagine a future without constant fear. There was school, new friendships beginning to form, and a home where she knew she would always be welcome. She looked over at her uncle, who was now reading a newspaper, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose. He was a simple, quiet man, but he showed his affection through small gestures, like preparing dinner or leaving a light on in the hallway so Emily would feel safe at night. "Thank you," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her uncle looked up from the newspaper, surprised. "For what?" Emily hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "For giving me a chance, for letting me keep Six, and for letting me be myself." He smiled, a sincere and warm smile. "You've always had a place here, Emily, and you always will, no matter what." With those words, Emily felt a lightness in her heart. There might still be a long journey ahead, and the marks of the past might never completely fade. But in that moment, she knew she was no longer alone. And with Six by her side, and an uncle who truly cared, she was finally beginning to believe that a new beginning was possible. Did you enjoy today's story? Give it a like and let us know in the comments. See you next time.